This is Superintendent Justin Dahlheimer coming to you to recap a meeting we had on December 9th, 2024, called our Truth in Taxation meeting. This is our annual conversation about the school's financial picture, and it also instructs our board and our community on why we set our local property tax levy at the place we do. So, going through where we left off in 2023, 2024, in the far right here, it's very appropriate to view our fund balance or our on-hand cash and what we can use it for, because that decides, in a sense, what our priorities need to be financially as we look at the health of the district and what type of revenue demands we have, and really what we're asking from our local taxpayers. So if you can see, we've been a very high fund balance district in the past. We had saved a lot of money that we ended up deploying to utilize to build a bus garage and tennis courts, and that project completed in 21-22 school year, and it did reduce our fund balance down to a point where we were hoping and working to grow back and stabilize, and we did accomplish that last year and grew our fund balance about $400,000. The other conversation about fund balance is, how flexible is that revenue to utilize, and if we need it in a pinch, is it there? And that's what our minimum fund balance policy establishes. And as you can see, that policy puts us at 2 months of a threshold of expenses. That's our goal. And right now we're at 1.5 months. And a lot of that has to do with the last 2 years of state mandates and restricted revenue sources that have come with a lot of contingencies. So money that used to come a little more flexibly that we could use our own discretion on now has to meet certain thresholds per state law that have changed. And that has caused a lot of our growth in fund balance to be in restricted accounts. So we are going to have to spend some extra time matching these expenses with eligible, per the law, funding sources. And then at that point, we can direct those expenses in that place and then possibly grow that unassigned fund balance because we're not using our flexible revenue sources to pay for them. And that is something that we are working on, and we will be attempting to do more of in the future. And it just takes time to catch up to a lot of the eligibilities on new revenue sources, because the state has to instruct us on all the things that we can use this money on, and it does take time for us to review that. We don't have on-staff accountants. We tend to do that within our own business office, and we throughout the year can look back and reclassify expenditures, and we're going to be doing that through the course of the year. But it's safe to say our fund balance is in a good situation and we are going the correct direction. It's just that we are below our minimum fund balance policy that we want to build back towards. And the other reason we have a minimum fund balance policy is because we borrow money. We pay back our building bonds, which we have a few more years left to pay on, that depend on our credit rating. And our credit rating is oftentimes established by our fund balance. And if you are below, say, 8% of restricted unassigned dollars, you would be in a situation where it potentially could see your credit rating change. And we are safely above that, and we have a solid credit rating, but we want to keep an eye on that because we don't want our interest rates to go up or our ability to borrow to be impacted, because you never know when we're going to need to issue bonds to pay for certain things. States sometimes withhold revenue sources during tight budget years and make districts borrow short term just to allow the state to handle some cash flow issues. And there's all kinds of other scenarios where your credit rating becomes important. So we do keep a close eye on this, so that way we are ready and able to have all options. The other thing we want to talk about is our 2024-2025 budget, which lays out where we spend our money. As you can see, people make up the most part of our budget. 68% of our budget last year was people, 70% will be this year. And that kind of tells you how important that our contracts and negotiations and how we establish those pay rates impact our future budgets. And this is a pretty predictable year because most of our contracts are 2-year contracts, and this year's already been set. So this number gets a little more unpredictable when we look to next year, because contracts would be back for negotiations, and we'd also be looking to the state for some guidance on revenue. So what I'm saying here is our budget's pretty stable and pretty similar to previous years, and we should have a pretty predictable financial situation for this year based on that. But the other element to this budget is enrollment. We budget for about 825 students K through 12, and we are now sitting at 864 students for this year. So we are sitting well ahead of where we budgeted, which is a good situation to be in, which means we should have on-hand revenue to utilize to possibly grow that fund balance again and potentially invest in things that maybe we set aside that we weren't sure we would have the funding. But the main message is that we've had a very stable and growing revenue situation because we've had stable and growing enrollment. And anytime you have predictability or volatility there, you start to see pressure on our day-to-day in terms of our cash flow. Well, we've been in a very fortunate situation that with a combination of open enrollment and resident growth, that we're growing our school to possibly the biggest it's ever been. And that's going to be great for our community because those are families that are looking at our community as the place they want long-term for their student, and also turns into great things outside our doors, pressure on building new homes, starting new businesses, all the trends that a healthy community looks forward to. So I think the main message off this slide is that we have been fortunate to have growing enrollment, and we've been prudent in budgeting. So about 40 students above where we thought we would be should mean a good situation for our revenue for this year. Which, speaking of revenue, you can see that really those students are very important because approximately 84% of our revenue comes from the state, meaning they match a certain rate per student and send it to our district based on the different grades, different services that they get, and they help supplement. So our local taxpayers pay about 13% of our general fund. So when we're talking about right here in this truth in taxation is our local property tax levy, and that's where that comes in for the most part to impact our budget. So as you can see, we're very aware and prudent about what we budget for enrollment because a large part of it is coming directly from the state based on that enrollment. And we utilize a lot of our local levy to deal with any ebbs and flows, but it's not going to impact the majority of our budget. It's just going to be there in somewhat of a supplemental way to help. So we want to be very predictable when we're budgeting because any large changes can't just be made up with local revenue sources. They're going to have to be made up with things that school districts don't like to do, like cutting. So we have utilized our growing enrollment to be in a situation where we can add services for our students and really operate at a better level for our community because we've been successful in attracting students into our community and stabilizing that growth. One of the other elements is beginning expenses is long-term expenses. And, we've had this conversation with our community for a couple of years now on the facility costs that are really sitting in front of us and what we're trying to improve over the course of the years. And, we have identified about $40 million of long-term facility costs that we have to plan to deal with from a long-term perspective. And some of that stuff happens every year. Some of that stuff has to be spread out just the way you would in fixing up a business and reinvesting it over a course of many years. And that's when we talk about referendums that voters see. It comes into this place because we're reinvesting in our facility that isn't something we can just get dollars attributed from the state towards. We have to work with you to figure out the best long-term strategy to reinvest in our building so we can continue to be a great school that meets all the goals of our community as well as the laws that the state imposes upon us. So we are still always having these conversations and making improvements where we can make them. But as you can see with our budget situation, we can't just pay $40 million out of our fund balance because we don't have it. And so we have to structure this in a way that's meaningful and get to a point where we likely have to reinvest the dollars that our voters have helped us with to the future. So in some ways, this is heavy on our minds when we're budgeting because we want to make sure we're taking care of the most need there. We're also wanting to make sure that something isn't becoming very expensive and annually putting a lot of cost on our school. And some of these things do in terms of our annual costs. And where we can make them better designed and they can become more efficient, we can, in a sense, free up annual dollars that we go to our taxpayers for. So in summary, our budget, really we're about $413,000 above where we thought we would be in June when we put this together because of the things I just talked about. And you can see that some of the unknowns going into 2025, 2026 are off to the left there in this column. And there are some things that the state has yet to elaborate on how expensive it's going to be for the school, like some of these unemployment law changes and our paid family leave. These are obligations that we know at some point we're going to have to play a role in budget for, but we don't know how much. But we do know at a minimum where our revenue should be from the state side, which, if you remember, was about 84% of our revenue. We should be getting a 2 to 3% increase there for sure. So we take that into account too, looking at the budget, that there is some revenue increases to come. And while these expenses are unknown, we feel with our fund balance and the situation we're at, we should be in a good place. So that's when we turn and look at what we might need to plan for from our local levy and set that at our Truth and Taxation meeting. And really, when we're talking about local levy, it's hopefully in its best case scenario utilizing and matched with state aid. And that's what they do for smaller school districts. Is for every dollar we take from our taxpayers, we get so much back from the state in aid in certain levy categories. And as you can see in the summary is, in 2022, for every dollar we levied, we got almost 37 cents back from the state in addition. Well, now we're at a point where for every dollar we're levying, we got about 20% back from the state, or 20 cents on the dollar, which is decreasing. And this is because our property value in our districts are all growing, and it's exceeding thresholds where the state will say, all right, you have enough property wealth, we don't need to give you as much aid. And this is happening statewide because they have not adjusted those tiers because everybody's property values are going up. And it's starting to, as a taxpayer, put more pressure on your local taxes because we're not getting the same amount of state aid as we used to. So I bring that up because we very much, when we're looking at truth and taxation and setting a levy that's responsible, is we're trying to utilize your dollars to go the furthest. So we're prioritizing being in places where we can get more state aid and trying to be cognizant where we're getting zero aid. Is this something we really need to be levying for this year? So that was the conversation we had at the Truth and Taxation meeting, is based on where our budget's at, we essentially can go lower than what we're max allowed, and we should reduce some of those categories that we get zero state aid on, so that way we can bring this down to an impact level that's more appropriate to our local taxpayers, and they feel it less at property tax payment dates. And so if we went with what we were max allowed, your property tax levy as a total would go up 10.4%. But with the recommendations that were adopted at the December 9th meeting, we're going up 4.66%. So less than half of what we are allowed to by statute, which is all because of the things I just went through and the positive trends in enrollment, the growing fund balance, and the options that we have from an annual year-to-year cash flow. And just in case you have your tax statement handy, I always like to put this in here to show you this is where we show up. And this is my tax statement. And you can see that your voter-approved levy, which is the levy that gets set when we issue bonds, and our bonds are coming due in 3 to 4 years, will be completely paid back. You can see that actually went down on my property tax statement, but our other local levy, which is the levy I just went through, our annual levy that's set at Truth and Taxation, sits on this line, and at the max, you can see my property taxes would have went up about $60 this year. But because of our decision to recommend a lower amount, we're actually going to not go up that much. So my house fell in this kind of range at 200 to 250,000, and I'm going to experience about a 1.9 to 2.3% increase versus a 5.9 to 6.3 if we would have went with the max. So it's not always 1-to-1. If it's a 4.6% levy increase, every property could be experiencing that differently. As you can see on this chart, it is very different. And if you get down into our agricultural properties, they're actually seeing a reduction in taxes due to some of the advantages they have with how state aid impacts farm properties differently than, say, commercial and residential. So I always put this slide in here because you never know. You can't assume. You should look at the value of your property and what is being done and how it impacts yours. And you can see kind of the range with this. So just kind of stepping back to our market values, I didn't really capture just kind of where the growth has been. And you can see really our property value across the board is about 50% more valuable than it was in 2021. And that's a pretty remarkable increase. And it's good to be in a school district with growing property values because we've have experienced school districts where they don't go up for various reasons. So, but as I mentioned earlier, that growth in property value does impact the amount of state aid we get. So, just keep that in mind. We want to be looking at the whole picture, and you also want to be taking a very close look at how it impacts you specifically. If you have any other concerns with anything you've seen, this is always my recommendation. Um, a lot of times there's moving parts on that tax statement. I just kind of went through all the different ways things can go up. It can be because your estimated market value went up, or it could because of your taxable market value didn't actually go up as much as you're estimated. There's just moving parts, and I caution everybody to take a very close look at what the moving parts are on theirs, because it's not always just what we set at the levy that impacts how much taxes you pay. So in some ways, if you have questions on that, it's always good to reach out and contact the assessor's office if it's a property valuation question at the particular county level. And there is places you can go through your property valuation, and they have a whole separate process than just what we're talking about here at Truth in Taxation. The other component I just wanted to plug for this year is because we do have a conversation about a referendum coming. And I did allude to the fact that there are some advantages to the voter approved levy, and why that mechanism is much more efficient, and why you maybe saw that in some instances your property tax that you pay in voter approved has gone down. And that's because of the tax value it's spread across. And as you can see, most of what I talked about today sits in this property tax base, referendum market value. And most of the people paying into that are residential. But if it's voter approved, if it's on a question on a ballot and it's approved by the voters, you can see the tax base grows, and there's more variety in the properties, and there's also state aid coming in the form of egg to school credit that helps spread the impact of that across more people, more properties, and more property wealth, as well as the advantages of state aid. And that's why I say that we talk about this annually, and we want to be aware of what we're bringing across our taxpayers and the increases that it poses. It's because these tax bases are very different in who they impact. And so it's very important to look at your own situation and understand that impact, because we're trying to make sure we're being efficient and asking the right people to pay for the right things. So, and the long-term reason for that is, say if you're somebody in a $170,000 house in 2018, and we're saving money every year to do building improvements that we could bond for. Well, if you look on here, our voter approved debt doesn't really grow much, obviously, because it's set. It's a payment. It's got to be the same every year to our tax base. So in many likelihood, it shouldn't grow if the tax values are growing. It should actually get more affordable in that situation. And as you're seeing here, our voter approved over the years for somebody in a property value here, as tax values have grown, actually becomes less of an obligation year to year. You know, we started paying $336 when we had a $170,000 home, and now we have a $250,000 home, and we're paying $303. You're actually seeing savings with property tax growth. With property value growth. Well, on the other hand, if every annually we're increasing our levy to accommodate expenses that are increasing within our district, and we're also trying to save money to pay for stuff that could be eligible for a project, we might likely be costing you more proportionally than we could if we could get this into a project that is funded by our voters. So, and in this instance, you would see somebody in this type of a home is actually paying significantly more than they were in 2018. You know, because of that combination of our values are growing, we're getting less state aid, and we're putting money away to pay for things that we might be able to structure across multiple years. Well, you'd be paying significantly more in this scenario, almost $300 per year more. And if you continue to see that type of pressure, that's the only mechanism the school district can really use effectively to solve long-term expenses. It is harder on people in that category of properties right in this referendum market value. So I know you might need to back up and re-listen to that portion. I only put it in here because it does instruct some of the honesty we're trying to have when we're going to our taxpayers is using the right way to pay for the right things. So with a referendum possibly coming, I think it's important to see we do consider this on an annual basis, and we don't want to be in a situation in the future where we're continuing to put pressure on our homeowners, our small business owners, our small farmers, because we can't find a solution of projects that is supported, and instead we're paying for this by saving this money every year and really putting it on essentially more people who have less options to repay. So I've said my piece there. I just want you to understand it because it does instruct. And if you have any other questions, do not hesitate to contact the district office. I can talk you through any of the things that didn't seem to make sense. And I just put this out here so you have a good place to reflect on it or possibly look at certain areas in depth. And if you couldn't possibly make it to a truth and taxation meeting, you don't have to worry about it because this is exactly what we talked about. Thank you.